Good afternoon, and welcome to High Stakes College Sports Without Affirmative Action. My name is Debbie Stroman, and I'm glad, very, very glad that you've joined us today. I want to give special thanks to University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill School of Global Public Health. I salute my colleagues who continue to try to make a difference in this world with public health outcomes, and the disparities. We have a lot to unpack today, and I want to start off by introducing this amazing panel. It's a group of good friends, people who walk the talk. They are scholars, they're faculty members, they're administrators, but they always keep the community first. And that is important, that is critical. And so let me begin with Dr. Joseph Cooper. He is the J. Keith Motley Endowed Chair of Sport Leadership and Administration at the University of Massachusetts at Boston. He's also the author of From Exploitation Back to Empowerment, Black Male Holistic Underdevelopment Through Sport and Miseducation. Welcome, Dr. Cooper. Dr. Tamika Ferguson. She is the Assistant Dean of Student Affairs and Inclusive Excellence at Virginia Commonwealth University. She's the founder of the Black Athlete Sister Circle, program for Black women student athletes at Division I institutions, and she's also the author of Protest, Politics, and Organized Resistance in Intercollegiate Athletics. Welcome, Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Richard Lapchick. He is the director of the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sports, we know it as TIDES, at the University of Central Florida. He's a human rights activist, internationally recognized expert on sports issues, a scholar, and oftentimes described as the racial conscious of sports. He is a 2023 ESPY awardee, receiving the Stuart Scott Inspire Award, named in honor of the late, great Stuart Scott, also a Tar Heel. And that award represents individuals that have taken risk and use an innovative approach to help the disadvantaged through the power of sports. Welcome, Dr. Lapchick. Dr. Michael McIntosh. He is the chair of the Department of Educational Leadership at Virginia State University. He served successfully as the principal investigator and director of the Hampton Leadership Academy. He's also the author of Compound Fractures, Healing the Intersectionality of Racism, Classism, and Trauma in Schools with a Trauma-Informed Approach as part of the Social Justice Framework. Welcome, Dr. McIntosh. And Professor Erica Wilson. She is a professor of law and Wade Edwards Distinguished Scholar at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And she is the author of Monopolizing Whiteness and the Legal Foundations of White Supremacy. Welcome to all. Thank you so much for joining. My why in doing this was, when that ruling came down about 2.5 weeks ago, there was no doubt, no surprise, but no doubt it really touched me in a way. And so I did my research, then I did conversations with friends, and then I thought it's time for us to come together and talk about it. So I just believe being in two spaces, in sport business and also racial equity education and strategy, that we need to talk about this and how it will affect college sports and our college campuses. So I'd like to go around and invite everyone to just share their reason why and why this works for you and your work in terms of this ruling. And I'll start off with Dr. McIntosh.
Thank you, Dr. Stroman. Dr. Stroman and I go back a long way. We're both fellow Tar Heels. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about the HBCU, Historically Black College and University perspective of this ruling. A lot of my cred comes from the fact that I have been a professor at 6 different HBCUs over 3 different states over my career. I was asked a question about how would HBCUs react to this decision, and I responded that it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity because HBCU enrollment has been steadily increasing over the last 5 to 7 years after this sort of noticeable deterioration of race relations or the racial environment here in the United States. A little background on historically Black colleges, though, even though we represent just 3% of the colleges, we produce 20% of the Black graduates here in these United States. And I also was met with this question about, well, what sort of marketing strategy are we going to use now that we're going to maybe see this influx of students? One of the things we can't be is we can't say, okay, we want you to come because you can't go anywhere else. That's not a great marketing strategy. We also can't be what's called PWI light. We can't, be taste great, less filling. We can't just say we're trying to be less of what we are, what you are, and you can come to us. And we have to really talk about the fact that HBCUs, they're an outstanding product. They produce 60% of the Black engineers, 50% of Black teachers, 70% of Black dentists and doctors. They produce 50% of Black lawyers and 80% of Black judges. So we have a product. And we've had an outstanding product. And what we need to do is sort of get into a marketing strategy where we can address the dearth of what's going to happen moving forward. We can't leave out the calculus of the fact that all HBCUs have been historically underfunded. And through that historical underfunding, I read in Fortune the other day that they said they did a study and found out for every dollar that's given to a predominantly white institution, an HBCU gets 59 cents. So because we've been historically underfunded for so long, we have to look at different strategies to market ourselves in a way that we're going to look at how we can deal with this influx of students coming in. Howard University, which has an average, which had an average of 6,000 application, now gets 32,000 applications each year. So again, we have to also be more selective, but we also cannot abandon our mission of why we were historically Black colleges and universities were formed. So my why for this is looking at the fact that that's the student part. The other part is the athlete part, and that the fact that even though I gave you all of those great numbers about what we do academically, we only got one student athlete drafted in the NFL draft. We had 0 athletes drafted in the NBA draft. And even though there were a number of athletes drafted in the Major League Baseball draft, most of those were going to single A or double A organizations. So the one side of it is we have a great product academically. The other side of it is that our athletics have been sort of maligned as being a less than. But what we're here to say at HBCUs is you can get there from here. And what this ruling has done is given us an opportunity to sort of reintroduce ourselves or introduce ourselves not only to the African-American community, but all of the other marginalized populations. And so my why is let's do a better job of marketing, but let's also deal with that culture on campus and the business model that leads to this perception that we're less than. And I think historically Black colleges and universities are going to meet the challenge because we have to. And if we don't meet the challenge, we're going to miss this really great opportunity to show how great we are, because we often don't get this opportunity to showcase ourselves. We've got an opportunity now, and I know we're going to meet the challenge.
Well, thank you for that why. We're going to come back to that with the HBCUs. Dr. Lapchick, what is your why?
Well, I view the Supreme Court decision as you did, Debbie, that it's on a continuum from the time Jamel Hill called Donald Trump a white supremacist rather. That philosophy has permeated so many layers of our society. 3 Supreme Court judges appointed by him, I think, directly led to this decision. I live in Florida, where there has been erosion of rights under this governor, DeSantis, ever since his second term started. There's a feeling here of people won't move to Florida because of the potential discrimination about LGBTQ communities, as well as communities of color. The impact that this may have on our student athletes is, I think, yet to be seen, but I'm going to follow very closely, if it's possible, the admissions standards at colleges and universities for student athletes, because we have long taken in student athletes who might not have met the exact parameters of admission, but showed that promise and got the support at the universities, got a great education, and were able to go out. I really liked Dr. McIntosh's analysis of how this might improve the opportunities for HBCUs to get some of those athletes who might not get into the predominant the historically white universities for at this time. And Dr. McIntosh, I have to tell you that 6 of our best students ever at the DeVos student graduate program were from Virginia State. So we know the quality of people that you produce there and are very appreciative of it. I hope that this Supreme Court decision, among other things, leads to an expansion of athlete activism, which I think has been a tremendous force in the past couple of years since the Milwaukee Bucks refused to come out during the NBA playoffs after the shooting in Kenosha. I agree that LeBron has been an outstanding leader, but he's been joined by lots of other athletes. I'm on the committee that gives the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar Social Justice Award, and each team nominates a player, and the things they're doing across the country are amazing. And I think it's a force that we're going to see become even more important in the future. So my question about the Supreme Court is what's going to go next? They're obviously going to continue to attack the rights that we've been comfortable with and fought so hard for over the years. And it's going to have a tremendous effect that I hope the 6 people here today, is the listeners who are tuning in, and audiences all across the country, will stand up tall against this assault on rights.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Ferguson.
Thanks for creating this platform, Deb. Wahoo, because I heard a little UNC earlier. You know, one of the things that really sparked me to feel like something was going to be different this time was the language that was inside of the majority opinion. And if those of you who have not read it, I strongly encourage you to take some time. It is very long, but there's some pieces of language in there that really stood out to me. And there was this one line in the majority opinion that said, eliminating racism means eliminating all of it. And I found that slightly hypocritical, because the entire point of affirmative action was to right a historical legacy of wrongs that had not yet been unwritten within our existing constitution and state laws and other federal policies. And so to say that this was somehow working to eliminate continued racial discrimination, it sounded counterproductive to me. And so I wanted to, in some way, figure out ways to learn how to navigate this system, because even in the majority opinion, it also highlights that at some point, affirmative action was supposed to end. I think it has ended too soon. I think it has been chipped away at over the last 20+ years, and it wasn't operating in the original fidelity in which it was created. And so what we've seen is admission and enrollment shifts constantly at PWIs and historically white colleges and universities shift to adapt to this and be more creative and think of race neutral policies and figure out ways to substitute Black or Brown or Hispanic or Latinx with low SES or neighborhoods or geo-targeting of recruitment. I oversee enrollment management and work in enrollment management as a part of my role as an assistant dean. And I have learned in my career that we can be very creative in how we create pipelines coming to the institution. However, when athletes were not considered as a part of this, that their labor is still somehow being used, it reminded me again of the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, remind me of all these pieces that I look forward to hearing from Dr. Wilson later. But it's very important that we pay attention to the creativity and going back and retrofitting policies that were anti-Black in its origination, just as though the founding of the country was. So when I think about policies, I think about being a leader and being in student affairs, being in enrollment management. There's a ripple effect. People are now afraid to speak diversity, equity, inclusion, decolonial work, anti-racism because of this ruling. And nothing in that ruling stops us from doing things from enrolled students or current students, or even to support our faculty. But one of the things that it does is causes these effects that we're going to see happen over and over again. And there's a lot that we still don't know. A lot of states have not released guidance to our admissions officers and admissions teams. So we're still in this bubble of what should we do and how do we adjust. And so as we move forward in the conversation, I think we have to think about the broader implications of the university and how those systems and policies are going to align with the state. So there might be some state influence from our board of visitors, our governor appointed elected officials that are going to influence what happens. And that means that some states are going to react a little bit differently than others. And that'll be interesting to see over the next few months and years.
Thank you. And we know there is a playbook in operation. And they're just going down the list. Professor Wilson, what is your why?
Thank you, Debbie. So my why is that a lot of my work centers around understand or analyzing race and educational opportunities. And there's no question that this Supreme Court decision is an attempt to reshape the way our society looks, who has opportunity and who does not have opportunity. And so I think for me, this has implications for student athletes, and I think it's important for us to think about student athletes beyond the athlete part. So in the fall of 2012, for example, at UCLA, where there's not been affirmative action since 1997 due to an amendment to the state constitution banning race-conscious admissions, there were approximately 19,838 male students. Only 660 of them were Black, and 65% or 429 of that 660 were athletes. And so this is significant because athletics has long been a door for Black students to get into universities they otherwise may not have gotten into. The end of race-conscious admissions will certainly, at a place like UNC, depending on which direction the administration decides to go, influence the entire environment for African-American students. And certainly if we are in a scenario where there are no race-conscious admissions, but certain athletes, predominantly Black, are still being admitted, it certainly sends an expressive message about the role of Black students on campus, what their role should be, which is to labor and not to be a full student. Certainly at UNC, we've dealt with environment issues. The environment issues will be critical in terms of not just whether or not Black student athletes in particular have an opportunity to be there, but what is it like when they are there? I've heard from student athletes now, even with race-conscious admissions, who feel like students come up to them on campus and assume that their only purpose is to entertain. And so my broader why is to analyze, examine, and push policies that expand educational opportunities for all and push us to think about the expressive message, particularly for Black student athletes at the end of affirmative action may signal for them.
Thank you. Dr. Cooper.
Thank you, Dr. Stroman, and great to be here with all my esteemed colleagues. My why is multi-layered. The broader why is centered on Black humanity, and what we're seeing with this affirmative action decision in conjunction with an attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, with the attack on critical race theory, on the teaching of African-American history, or even just an authentic, honest account of American history, is this intergenerational effort to oppress Black people and other vulnerable populations. So it's this idea of, historically, de jure racial discrimination was legalized through policies, and over time it's been masked through these de facto race neutral policies that have racialized impacts. So essentially what I look at it as a human rights issue. When you think about the civil rights movement and the efforts that were levied by my ancestors and our ancestors to secure access to education, access to public accommodations, voting rights, all of those were civil rights grounded in being treated as a human and as a citizen of this country. So by the reversal of this affirmative action, to me, it's just another attack on Black humanity. More specifically, within my work on Black holistic athletes, what will be a consequence of this decision is that the campus climate conditions that were already racially chilly and already marginalizing for Black holistic athletes is going to be exacerbated. Because what's going to happen is that there's going to be, outside of, as Dr. McIntosh mentioned, at HBCUs, outside of those institutions, when you don't have a critical mass of Black students within and beyond the athletic realm, including Black faculty and staff that have cultural backgrounds that are congruent and relatable to the students who are enrolling in the institution, you're creating an environment that communicates that who you are, where you come from is not valued. So what that means is, just to echo the sentiments of my colleagues, is that you're reminding Black holistic athletes that the primary reason that you're valued here is for your athletic labor. We don't value you holistically. We don't value your communities. We don't believe you belong in STEM programs and business schools and law schools. We are actually trying to revert back to a time where we didn't allow you at all by law. So now we're trying to do that in a more what seemingly is a covert way. So I think that the harms that will be experienced by the Black holistic athletes on these campuses will be paramount. And I think it's important on all of us to be very vigilant. I think it's important that we use language like this is an attack on civil rights, and this is also a violation of human rights in terms of access to higher education and access to economic opportunities to combat the current social stratification that exists in our society, which is directly connected to racial oppression.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for your opening comments and your why. I think it's important when we look at this affirmative action ruling by our Supreme Court that we look at our history. There is no doubt that I'm a big believer in studying and learning the past, but I want to take us back so that we can get the proper context and ask Professor Wilson to follow up in terms of these important laws that were passed for affirmative action. So I want to take you back to 1619, when that first ship arrived on the shores, the colony of Virginia in modern day Hampton, Virginia, with 20 to 30 Africans. And they arrived, and I don't debate like some scholars in terms of whether or not they were whether or not they were enslaved or whether they were indentured. What I focus on is the fact that they were unfree for 246 years, chattel slavery, worth no more than a pig or a horse or a cow. And then we had another 100 years of Jim Crow, state-sponsored, state-sanctioned, where it was not legal for Blacks to go to restaurants, movie theaters, hotels, educational institutions. And so we're talking about 87% of our nation's history, 87% of our nation's history, we've been disadvantaged. Now, during this time period, there was something else going on besides enslavement. Our systems and institutions were being birthed, and they were birthed to advantage white people, in particular white men. And so what have we done to interrupt that? Some people can look at it and say, we've made great progress. Others can look at the realities and say, we haven't made much progress at all. And so 87% of our nation's history, we've been trying to get it right, been struggling with this. And so when you think about athletics, as it's been stated, it's been one window of access, and then that to be limited. And the other thing I want to mention is, isn't it interesting that when some people consider affirmative action, they think that the people who've enrolled, the people who were accepted, that they were less than, that they're not qualified. Very, very qualified. And race is just one factor. Race is just one factor. So Professor Wilson, can you take us through the amendments and how that applies here?
Absolutely. So in order to understand the debate about affirmative action, it is important to understand the constitutional grounding for affirmative action. So it's important to start with what we call the Reconstruction Amendments, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. So these Reconstruction Amendments were crucial to providing African Americans with the rights and protections of citizenship, with their humanity, frankly, that they were denied during enslavement and later would be denied during Jim Crow. So the 13th Amendment formally abolished enslavement, 13th Amendment formally abolished enslavement, the 14th Amendment established Black people as equal citizens of the United States. And the 14th Amendment is particularly important because it overturned an 1857 case called Dred Scott v. Sanford, where the Supreme Court wrote that Black Americans were not citizens and had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect. And so that history of the 14th Amendment is really important because in the recent affirmative action decision, John Roberts and the rest of the majority interpreted that 14th Amendment in a way that was intended to protect white citizens in certain ways and not Black citizens, but I'll come back to that. Finally, the last Reconstruction Amendment, the 15th Amendment, gave Black people, Black men, the right to vote. They really are, these amendments, the backbone of making sure that America comes close to living up to its ideals of freedom and equality for everyone. But as we know, even after the Reconstruction Amendments were enacted, Black people were still cast as a second-class citizen. The 14th Amendment was interpreted to allow Jim Crow segregation. It was interpreted to allow universities like UNC to deny admission to people like Pauli Murray. And so the 14th Amendment is a living thing, I will put it that way. And the court has certainly interpreted and reinterpreted in particular ways. And so one of the reinterpretations of the 14th Amendment was to, during the civil rights era, to recognize that it's not enough just to ostensibly treat people equally, but it's necessary for some repair for what has been done to Black people, to open up doors that were previously denied. And so this was the genesis of affirmative action. The giving universities the ability to consider race in the admissions process in order to make sure that Black and other marginalized groups were given an opportunity they would otherwise be denied to enroll at universities. And so the 14th Amendment guarantees all people equal protection under the law, which is now interpreted to mean that everyone should be treated the same without any racial distinctions whatsoever. The one way that racial distinctions can be made that and still put you in compliance in the 14th Amendment is if there's a compelling state interest involved and there are means used to achieve that compelling state interest that are narrowly tailored to do so. So in the context of affirmative action, there's a line of cases beginning with the case called Bakke, then Grutter, and then Fisher, in which the Supreme Court said that universities attempting to enroll a racially diverse student body is a compelling state interest, and considering race as one factor amongst many is appropriate under the 14th Amendment in order to achieve the goal of obtaining a racially diverse student body. So in the recent Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard and UNC cases, plaintiffs challenged that interpretation of the 14th Amendment. They essentially claimed that the way that universities were considering race in admissions disadvantaged white and Asian applicants. They asked the court to overrule its precedent in Bakke, Grutter, and Fisher and to hold that institutions of higher education can't use race as a factor in admission. They were essentially asking the court to redefine what is lawful under the way that we interpret the 14th Amendment, and to find that this idea of racial diversity is not a compelling state interest. And even if the court finds that it is still a compelling state interest, the way universities are using race does not pass constitutional muster, because universities aren't doing it in a way that is fair to all, and instead are doing it in a way that unfairly burdens or punishes white and Asian students. And so the majority opinion essentially agreed and found that Harvard and UNC's admissions programs lack the sufficient focus and measurable objectives warranting the use of race, that they unavoidably use stereotypes when formulating their admissions policies, and that they lack meaningful endpoints, and that those things could not be reconciled with the guarantees of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. And so the court's interpretation is really important here, because they are essentially interpreting the 14th Amendment in a way that requires a historical understanding of the world in which we live in. One great disappointment for me in the majority opinion is that it gives this fallacy that Black, brown, and marginalized students have the same access to educational opportunities as white and affluent students. We know they don't. But the court ignores that and instead says that the way these universities are considering race in their admissions policies are unlawful. One important thing I wanted to point out, I think from an advocacy perspective, this is important. On my read, the court didn't come out and say racial diversity is no longer a compelling state interest, but instead said the way that universities are formulating their admissions policies wasn't sufficient. To me, this suggests, particularly with other language in the opinion where the court said that universities could consider the way that race impacted an applicant's life, means that there's room for universities to still consider race in admissions and do so in ways that enables them to enroll a critical mass of students of color. And so it's going to be really important as this Supreme Court in particular continues to narrow the way that we interpret the 14th Amendment, that universities don't turtle up and that they take advantage of the language in that opinion to continue to fashion robust admissions policies that allow them to enroll a racially diverse student body.
Thank you. Thank you for that overview and excellent analysis of the law. And so moving forward, sports, as we've mentioned, did serve as a window of opportunity. The studies say that a college graduate is much more likely to earn over $1 million over a lifetime than a non-college student, someone who does not attend. And so with athletics being one of those windows of opportunity, and even though we don't have many brown and Black students on our college campuses, where are we? What is working? What's not working? Dr. Lapchick, can you share with us what is going on with college sports? Tell us from your perspective and your research.
Well, Debbie, we do these racial and gender report cards on all the major pro sports and college sport. And as somebody who's worked on a college campus for more than 50 years, I am so disappointed that the institutions I represent have the worst hiring records for all the positions of importance in athletic departments. Just to give you a brief rundown of head coaches of men's teams in Division I, 81%, Division II, 81%, Division III, 89% of the head coaches are white. On women's teams, 77%, 79%, and 90% are white on women's teams. Assistant coaches, 67%, 68%, and 83% in Division III on men's teams, 67%, 73%, 86%. In Division III on women's teams. Conference commissioners are 70% white men. 57 white men lead the Division I conferences, excluding the HBCUs. Presidents, 59% white men, 21% white women. ADs, 68%, 63%, 61% in Division III are white men. White women represent 15%, 24%, and 33%. We could go right down through the athletic department, and the statistics get only worse. And not only are those numbers bad, but I'm lucky enough to speak on about 20 college campuses a year. And invariably, I'm picked up at the airport by the senior African-American, either in the president's office, if that's who's bringing me, or the athletic director's office, if that's who's bringing me. And on the way to wherever they're bringing me to the hotel, usually, they talk about what a wonderful place this is and how a great place to raise their family. And after my presentation, when they're taking me back, after they've learned a little bit about my background and have a little bit more trust in this 78-year-old white guy, the conversation almost always goes like this: can you help me get out of here? They feel unwanted. They feel people look at them and think that they were appointed because they were Black, that they were promoted because they were Black, or they think they weren't promoted because they were Black, or whatever the color of their skin might be. So it's a distinct embarrassment for me to have to give you these numbers about our college campuses, because we're failing as badly as any other sector that I can think of in higher education. And people think that opportunities are better because there's so many Black athletes playing, but that's not representing who they play for and who runs those programs. And I think this is a serious issue that has yet to be dealt with in the past up to now, and I don't see it changing very dramatically in the near term.
Well, that says a lot for you to make that statement, considering your deep research and your contacts and work all across the country. Dr. Cooper, you've certainly done research on Black athletes at HBCUs and HWCUs, but particularly, what do you think the state of Black athletes on historically white institutions on those campuses? What's your take on it, including mental health?
Absolutely. I think, to put it succinctly, the state of Black holistic athletes at HWCUs remains that they are holistically invisible and undersupported and athletically hypervisible. So a number of my colleagues and I, we frame the invisibility, hypervisibility language as critically important. So when we say holistically invisible, as you alluded to, Dr. Stroman, the mental health needs, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, and what many of us would call the Black Lives Matter era, where it was routine to see on the news unarmed African Americans be murdered by law enforcement and other vigilantes, and it go unpunished, largely unpunished. The amount of trauma that takes on a person, not to mention the racial battle fatigue, the anti-Black misandry, the misogynoir, the anti-Black misogynoir. I mean, there's layers to the trauma that Black people experience. And just because you put a uniform on and you perform well, and maybe you earn a little bit more money or a little bit more visibility, you might have more Twitter followers, it doesn't heal the wounds fully. And so what at these institutions, there's what's going well. What I will say is that there are tremendous faculty members such as yourself who have been galvanizing Black college athletes to help empower them to not only to know about their rights, to get engaged at the campus level, but also in the communities, as well as in voting and getting voter registration to help shift some of these laws and policies. So that's been working well. I would just champion the resiliency of the Black college athletes supporting each other in spite of having, as Dr. Lapchick mentioned, coaches who are disconnected and not interested in their well-being beyond what they can do to perform athletic entertainment and economic benefits. So as Dr. Lapchick mentioned, when there's an underrepresentation of Black coaches and athletic administrators who have a direct lived experience and understanding of the challenges of living in a society where anti-Black racism is pervasive, there's just a total disregard or even a nominal regard. Even when we think about the athlete activism over the past several years, much of that was co-opted by athletic departments to misdirect the criticisms towards structural change and radical reform, and to do it more towards more symbolic nominal efforts. And so in that way, another example of what the holistic invisibility is that these Black college athletes, holistic college athletes, are being targeted for disempowerment. And when you disempower groups, so there's a difference between focusing on eligibility and focusing on the illusion of athletic success, because we all know the percentages of these college athletes that will matriculate to the professional level, even when you account for those who play overseas or compete overseas, it's a very small number. So then the question becomes, what is the support and the concern for their holistic development, not only while they're at your institution, but more importantly, after they transition? So there are certain institutions that have provided infrastructure connecting former athletes with current college athletes, connecting with resources, internships. There are programs that provide study abroad opportunities, research opportunities for college athletes. But a majority of these institutions, either due to a lack of resources or more what I would say a lack of ethic of care, are continuing to devalue the holistic well-being of these college athletes. And it is exacerbating mental health issues. It's having a negative impact on educational attainment. And more importantly, it's leading to residual impacts on the community at large. So I think that there's a tremendous amount of work to be done, just like our broader society. within athletic departments, within the NCAA, and within institutions of higher education, there needs to be a racial reckoning. We need to be honest about what has happened throughout, as you mentioned, the 87% of our country's history. And even with that 13%, the barriers that still remain, even with that progress. And we need to understand that in order to change that, we need to have race conscious policies that say this is a part of our healing. This is a part of us really, as Dr. Wilson mentioned, living up to our true ideals as to what this country is supposed to represent.
There's so much on that. Thank you so much. It makes me think of my numerous experiences, lived and observations of seeing this sense of fear of the Black intellectual, the Black scholar. Very, very directly trying to keep us away from Black athletes. Because there is a lack of understanding of what we do and how we do it, it's better just to keep us away. How many times do we have opportunities where Black faculty, Black administrators can spend time with Black athletes? It's almost by design that it will not happen. And then if you are ushered in, then you have to be and do a certain way. I'll leave it there. Dr. Ferguson, you have two hats that you wear, faculty, administration, and I also must mention that you are an All-American athlete at the University of Virginia in track, and so track and field. So please share your thoughts.
So I wear two hats, and sometimes those two hats are in conflict. And this is one of those areas where I feel conflict, because as a faculty member, as a former athlete who does work with athletes who are Black women through programming and providing spaces where being unapologetically Black and woman and an athlete does not exist in other spaces, there's a lot of red tape that some of what Dr. Cooper brought up has been created in order to kind of protect and create this barrier of access to athletes. What the policies that we have to navigate through do, these policies are created by individuals who hold sometimes similar or opposing views of what we should be doing, which is educating all students. And so when I think about this role, I think about administratively, what we can do, and then I think about our role as researchers and faculty. So Dr. Eddie Cole, who's an associate professor at UCLA, wrote a book called The Campus Color Line. I fully recommend it. In his book, he talks about the role of college presidents during civil rights and prior to civil rights movement, and the role in which the Black college presidents had to take on in their statements, existing in states with federal and state policies that were against their presence, their being, and their body. And he talked about the courageous acts and the risk and the amount of not just courage, but the amount of finesse it took to stand up and speak against opposing views. And I almost feel like the change in policies for us not to be able to use race-conscious admission policies might be causing college presidents to start questioning what risk are they willing to take in order to meet and serve the needs of all students. You put the nail on the head, Dr. Cooper, when you said it's the reverberation into our community. We know that our institutions are economic powerhouses. We are employing community members. We are producing research. We have community-based centers. Some of our campuses have hospitals. And so these policies impact not just the undergrad population. We're talking about graduate school. The reverberating effect could impact pipelines to having racial equity within healthcare centers and future professional areas. And so these are areas that we have to consider. If someone's afraid to allow in someone who looks different than the majority or the entire faculty, what can we do to remedy that? So we have now taken away tools to provide pipelines to community and civil and legal arenas to where we can have more, a decrease in racial disparity. So I wanted to bring that up because I do believe that it does start with the senior leadership. We have to start thinking, are college presidents equipped and supported enough by their board of visitors and public spaces and private spaces? Is there enough funding coming through to support the endeavors that we need? Because without that, the trickle down effect is scared, responses, fearfulness, to be able to say, well, what can we do to navigate this? Historically, race neutral approaches have not proven to be successful, okay? So for those of you who are unfamiliar with what's a race neutral policy, think about funding for low income students, think about funding for certain people for different zip codes, or neighborhood initiatives that might be similar to those done through Rutgers or USC. Consider having pipelines to graduate schools, for instance, from HBCUs to some of our historically white colleges and universities, targeting high school admissions, thinking about community college pipelines. So there's been creativity in trying to navigate the legal landscape so that we can be inclusive and we can live up to our mission as the academic enterprises that we are, but they have not been successful because universities are ill-equipped, all 4,000 plus, to remedy societal wrongs. Again, like Deb, you pointed out, 87% of our history has been that of disadvantage to Black and also other ethnicities and races. And we have to consider that society has not created the mechanisms to serve as atonement, to fix it, to switch it up. We have 15% of our athletes right now who are NCAA institutions across D1, 2, and 3 who are Black. That's it, right? We have not achieved some 50%. And if we want to break it down and disaggregate the data using the NCAA demographics database, we're looking at maybe 5%, 1%, 0.0% in some spaces. So racial equity has not been achieved within athletics, even with admissions and with preferential treatment and preferential admissions pipelines. So now that we have to see the impact of broader pipelines to create spaces to where Black students are even interested in higher education. So I read an article that said we now have to refocus our efforts to have academics be the focus. A focus on academics is not going to guarantee my daughter admissions to Harvard. It's not. It's not going to guarantee her admissions to James Madison University or Duke. It's not enough. And I don't want her to use a deficit approach from a counselor to say, talk about what it's like to be Black, or talk about what it's like to grow up in whatever it is. We should not have to use identity through a deficit lens in order to remedy a wrong that our society has created. And now our leaders for our nation see as that's not worth the investment of time. And one thing that we have to do in focusing on human rights is that we are worth it. So individuals of color are worth it. People who come from populations and environments and neighborhoods and zip codes that are dealing with so much intersectional approaches of discrimination and oppression, whatever efforts we have to create equity and not equality are worth it. It's whether or not we have the courage and the spaces at the table in the president's office that are boards of visitors or boards of trustees, that are state legislators, that are part of our K-12 systems, school boards. Are they going to be brave enough to find ways to remedy these pipelines if this federal policy is going to continue for decades more? And I'm certain there's going to be a lot more challenge to this that we have not even come to as an education system. But I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that it's not higher ed problem. It is America's problem. It is not the responsibility of Virginia State University and other historically Black colleges and universities or public Black institutions or now newly HSIs or Annapeaseys. It's not the responsibility of those who have a majority to remedy the wrongs. And we don't have the resources that the pipeline suggests, right? And I know that Dr. McIntosh is going to get into it, but we cannot count on those institutions that have not been equipped to remedy the wrongs of historically white colleges and universities. And so it is my recommendation that our senior leaders on campuses have very hard conversations about what are they willing to risk in order to remain equitable and in order to remain inclusive. Because if there is no courage at the top, there will be no resources at the bottom.
Thank you, Dr. Ferguson. Going over the history, again, 246 years of enslavement, and understanding that most of our systems and institutions were birthed during that time period, they were birthed during a time period of white supremacy. White supremacy, which takes the collective and moves it to the individual, right? Meritocracy. And when we see this affirmative action ruling, that's what I saw. Let's forget the past, the collective experience of Black Americans, and go to individual ability to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. And so again, very, very challenging, very challenging. Dr. McIntosh, there is no doubt people are saying HBCUs need to seize the moment. And as Dr. Ferguson said, just not equipped. Not equipped. I think it's 7% of
Yeah.
the, okay, well, please take it from there.
I want to echo a few of the things that Dr. Ferguson and Dr. Cooper said about the pipeline. I just find an enormous amount of irony, and we talked about this earlier, that UNC was listed in this suit about, the admissions policies for African Americans, when we've been battling for the last 30, 35 years, trying to increase African American presence on the campus of UNC. One of the most disheartening statistics is that there was an article written that said over the last 2 to 3 decades, out of a freshman class of 5,100 at UNC, the university had not been able to admit 100 Black men in any class in the last 30 years. Just chew on that for a while. Over 5,000 freshmen in a state that is almost 30% African American, that is almost 40% other, minority and marginalized. You didn't admit 100 men, but you're being sued for access of African Americans to a system that is already systematically marginalizing them and keeping them out of the pipeline. Also wanted to, just to talk about the collateral damage. I gave the information about how we're getting 32,000 applications, which means, and many of the historically Black colleges are looking at increasing their admission standards. Well, the collateral damage is our original mission was to be opportunity universities, to work with those students who did not have the wherewithal or the preparation to go to a college, to give them that opportunity to move, to matriculate, and to earn a college education. The collateral damage will be that even at these historically Black colleges, we're going to become more selective, and they will be pushed out of the pipeline. The other thing that's going to happen is Dr. Ferguson and VCU, we're sister institutions as it relates to being state institutions. But when you sever that pipeline, we're no longer going to be able to send some of our kids to their graduate programs, because there's no longer going to be that search for that bright student. And I think there's this fallacy that you mentioned earlier, that somehow affirmative action was letting in hordes of Black students who were unqualified to be there. And nothing can be farther from the truth. What affirmative action said is that we're going to affirm that we look for you, and that we're going to look for you in such a way that we're going to give you this opportunity to matriculate at the Harvards and the Yales and the Princeton's. But we get sort of mixed up in the numbers, because we start talking about these Ivy schools. And one of the things I found out was that if you count all 9 of those Ivy schools, they have less Black students than at Howard University. And Howard University is 2/3 African American. So we're not talking about a large number, but we're using this overarching individualism to say this is what we're going to do for all of our Black students. So we're ending the pipeline, and we're also asking the victim to help their oppressor. We're asking these historically underfunded universities that you gave 59 cents on a dollar to for the last 100 years, some since 1882 when we were established. Now you're asking us to right the wrongs that you have created, and it just won't happen. We're going to have 1,500 students, freshmen coming on campus, which is going to be one of our largest classes, maybe in the last 20 years. But our infrastructure is not there to really serve those students in such a way that we can give them that same sort of experience. We're working hard to do it. At Chapel Hill, I think around 60% of the students, they study abroad before they graduate. At historically Black colleges, that number is around 20%. So again, you're asking us to do these things, to put us to stand in the gap when you have historically underfunded us and not given us the resources that we need to move forward. It's very ironic, and I don't want to sort of push historically Black colleges as the savior, that they're going to be the ones that's going to take the spillage. What we have to first recognize is that we don't have the capacity for it. And we also have to understand that those students who are not going to be otherwise able to attend the Harvards and the Michigans and the Stanfords, those are not marginal students. Those are students who would otherwise be getting race-based scholarships and grants and merit-based scholarships. So those students, if historically Black colleges don't have the wherewithal, those students are going to go to mid-major white schools. They're not going to come to historically Black colleges. They're going to go to schools like your Miami of Ohio and your App States and those colleges that have the infrastructure to welcome those students. So I think a lot of this is sort of misguided to say that HBCUs are going to stand in the gap, when in fact we've been so historically underfunded for such a long time. And I have to echo again what Dr. Cooper said about the mental health of what we're actually doing to these athletes when we ostracize and alienate them on a otherwise white campus. I remember my first day on campus when we were at pre-O and it was just Black folks up there. I was like, wow, there's a lot of Black folks here at UNC Chapel Hill, until the next week when 23,000 white folks came to campus. And then we immediately saw how alienated and how ostracized we were. So I think we're going to have a bigger conversation, like Dr. Cooper said, about what's going to be the lasting damage of this affirmative action decision, and what's going to be what are going to be some of the strategies that we're going to unfold. The first thing we need to do, much like an alcoholic, is we need to recognize that we have a problem. And we need to start at that juncture, and there needs to be some courageous conversations that happen in boardrooms and board of trustee rooms and board of visitors. But you've also looked at what's happening within our state of North Carolina, and the governors appointing the board of trustees and the board of governors for the university system. And it hasn't been too long ago that in 1956, when the board of governors said there will be no Black students at any UNC system schools. So for us to say that we've arrived and racism is no longer an issue is both naive and dangerous.
Thank you, Dr. McIntosh. Dr. Lapchick, I would love for you to jump in and talk about how you've been conducting this research, your colleagues, the graduate students, and yet year after year after year, there isn't much improvement at all. And so what would you say to white administrators, Black administrators, administrators of color, in terms of how do we move this needle? Because nothing's changed. You're on mute. There we go.
Sorry. If I had an easy answer to that, I would have given it a long time ago. But, I think there's resistance of people who look like me to give up power. And that's the bottom line. And the ability of people of color and women to get in those positions has been hindered by that force that white men have. And I think that policies for example, we went to the NFL in 2001, threatening legal action with Johnny Cochran, myself, and Cyrus Merry if they didn't change their hiring practices. The Rooney Rule resulted. It helped for a few years, but then it stopped helping. So we can come up with some creative policies, and different universities have, but their ability to withstand the test of time over decades just hasn't happened. And that's why we see these same numbers, especially in college sport. We look at the NBA, which ironically, I'm reading the Racial and Gender Report Card this morning, editing it, and they have historically been the best of all the sports leagues. And one of the things that they did is David Stern early on said, we are going to change the way we hire people, and as coaches, as general managers, or league offices, based on revenue sharing. We're going to award the teams that do it well with increased revenue and take away revenue from other teams. And that was a game changer. We need something dramatic, and I don't know what it is at the college level, to induce people to do the right thing, and to know that just doing the right thing isn't an ethical decision, it's a good business decision. We're going to be better institutions if we're more diverse in the president's office and the AD's office and the student body and across the board. We will be better serving our students if that exists on our college campuses as opposed to what exists now.
Thank you. Professor Wilson, maybe with the Great Awakening with the unfortunate tragic death of George Floyd, we saw more DEI offices being established, and the hirings varied from having a white person, which would demonstrate power, and we're really committed to this, to hiring brown and Black people. But now with this ruling, we're seeing many of these offices being dismantled, many of the positions being tossed aside or embed them in some other part of the campus. What's your take on DEI offices and people having particular responsibilities in this space on our college campuses?
Yeah, I think it's also important to point out that a lot of people were rolling back DEI efforts even before this decision. I think this decision gives even more credence to do so, but the backlash had already begun. We had about maybe a year of positive efforts, and then we slowly start to see them recede, and now this appears to be the hammer that is allowing further retraction. So I think that, as Dr. Lapchak said, this ultimately comes down to an issue of power. And one of the really scary, for lack of a better word, things is that many universities are going to fear further litigation and use that as a reason to roll back DEI efforts. I think that power concedes nothing without a demand. So it's going to require organizing by faculty. I've been loud and clear saying that tenured faculty in particular have an obligation to organize and advocate and push the administration. Students, certainly, student athletes certainly should organize as well. I do think that these universities do have an obligation not to roll back DEI efforts, and that there's also a legal basis to make demands. I mean, Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act prevents universities from maintaining a racially hostile environment. I would make arguments that an environment that is resegregated, where Black and brown students are a handful of students, particularly on a campus with a history of maintaining Confederate memorabilia, for example, requires that university to take extra steps to avoid having a racially hostile environment. So pressing those kind of levers as well. I think the bottom line is that it's going to require a lot of organization, a lot of pinpoint pressure. And I think student athletes have an important role they can play here. They certainly wield a lot of power in certain sports and certain institutions, and it would be good to help them to organize and to, along with faculty and staff, to apply pressure.
Thank you. And we know that dialogue is important, these courageous conversations, but it's not enough. In fact, this gathering today is a call to action in terms of what we can do, what we can model for others all across the country. I have a list of things that Black athletes should do in terms of continuing to gain consciousness and to always consider liberation. And so one of the things is start interviewing your head coach, whether you're a recruit or whether you're on campus. How do you feel about the affirmative action ruling? What is your take on white supremacy? In fact, define it for me. See, those type of conversations don't really happen, I don't believe, but we need to have our athletes feel that they can have these conversations with their coaches. Dr. Cooper, what are some of your thoughts in terms of what can be done?
Yeah, I just want to echo the sentiments of Dr. Wilson. I think one of the strategies that's been essential to the advancement of African Americans and African diasporic people globally is organization. And that can be race-centric, but it can also be with allies and other advocates from different backgrounds where there's some converging interests. Because I know we've talked a lot about Black college athletes, holistic athletes today, but this affirmative action decision will impact quite a bit of other racial groups and other gender groups, to be quite honest. I think there's a statistic that's been widely cited that, white women have been some of the largest beneficiaries of affirmative action broadly. Depending on the industry, that's more accurate than others. But nonetheless, this is going to have an impact on other groups. So I think organization is critical. I think, as you just outlined, Dr. Stroman, there needs to be concerted conscious raising endeavors, which can be in partnership with community organizations, activist groups, faith-based organizations, where there's an understanding of the connectivity between the restrictions and the marginalization that those in athletic spaces experience with broader oppression that's happening within the university with Black faculty, with staff, with communities that typically are right on the edge of campus, ironically, of these major Power 5 universities, but are racially dissimilar from the student body and from the university, and economically on the polar opposite ends in terms of resources. So I think that that's really important. I also think it's important just to look at the playbooks that's been used in the past. We could look at Dr. Lapchick and his work with the anti-apartheid movement through sport, Dr. Harry Edwards and his work not only with the Olympic Project for Human Rights. I mean, we've got evidence of how we can strategically leverage our resources and our influence because we know there's multiple types of activism. So as Dr. Wilson mentioned, the legal activism is really important. As Dr. McIntosh mentioned, we can use scholarly activism and we can use grassroots activism and institutional activism to combat. But we also know that particularly at these Power 5 institutions, as the Mizzou football team demonstrated a few years ago, economic activism through athletics is a big factor that could halt the machine. So if you get a group of conscious Black college athletes to be at least in agreement on some basic tenets of what we're trying to accomplish, doesn't mean there has to be uniformity on every point, but some basic core values that are in alignment. You know, we saw the power of what Colin Kaepernick did just by simply taking a knee. So you could imagine if you get a contingency of Black college athletes, which I think would be particularly powerful if there were a group of Black college athletes at HBCUs and at HWCUs who came together and said, we are one. We're not going to let these divisions block the fact that we've got some common interests, because many of the graduates of HBCUs and the Black students who graduate from HWCUs, not only do they end up marrying each other, living in the same neighborhoods, living in the same communities, going to the same faith-based institutions, but many and oftentimes we're connected in other ways. So I think bridging those gaps, identifying, as you mentioned, core aims and demands that need to be met, and understanding that this is a protracted struggle, that the forces that be, when you think about what previous President Trump, when he initially appointed the Supreme Court justices and a number of other acts that he initiated prior to leaving office, now those things are starting to manifest. So this has been a multi-year strategy by the opposition to get to this point. We also have to look at our resistance efforts as a protracted effort. And make sure that we leverage every influence that we have, because the system does have vulnerabilities and we can attack them, but we just have to be committed and precise with those efforts.
Thank you. One of my favorite quotes is, one of the problems of enslavement is that it's taught through the lens, or taught as the history of Black people and not the history of white people. And so oftentimes when we have these conversations, we do these examinations, we're looking at what happened to us, what happened to brown and Black people, and not shining a spotlight on the advantage that is given year after year after year to whites. And so I'm talking about legacy admissions. Dr. Ferguson, can you speak a bit about legacy admissions, and do you see it ever changing? Because that is a big reason why some people get into these top elite schools and they're not qualified.
You know, this is loaded because as a graduate of UVA, I want my daughter to go to UVA, right? And I'm now a part of a generation, and I think we're seeing more meaning very small percentages of legacy admissions at some of the HWCUs, right? So we're seeing it. but it still doesn't mean that it's an equitable pathway that we can support just because now there's a smaller generation of us that might benefit from it, or our children might benefit from it. Legacy admissions have always been used, and it's not based on merit, it's not based on attractiveness, it's not even based on mission of institutions. It's solely based on birthright. And so in the majority opinion by Justice Thomas, not one of the justices, I read that is a long document.
Robert.
He talked about how legacy admissions was not necessarily something that fit within the realm of scrutiny, right? And so if we think about attacking it, they have more people through legacy admissions than people that might benefit from race. And I don't think that they want to attack it because one, of power, two, of prestige, and three, because of money. And it's probably more three because of money. If I can donate money and my name are on buildings, and I know that I can find some benefit for my child and their children, why not support it? The attack on it kind of also reminds me of the attack against using the athletes at the Ivy League schools, all the cases and the famous people who went to jail. It's almost like athletics was seen as the same as legacy admissions almost, right? That there's always going to be a pipeline that those in power will exploit the vulnerabilities in to win. And so if we do see the case that's now before them, that's attacking the legacy admissions, that's brought by Black and Latina organizations, I'm interested in watching that happen because it's going to be interesting to hear the arguments on both sides to see the merits of whether or not that will continue. But what will happen with fundraising? What will happen with philanthropy? I think they will have significant impacts for our private colleges because what's the value add for a donor if it's not a benefit for me? That's the interest convergence, right? I need to be able to win if I'm going to partner with you on something. And so right now, my stance is that it should be wiped away. If affirmative action is going to be there on race, it should wipe out all of those specific categories, including others that we might not even hear about. But the challenge that I think is that there will be some people who will argue that legacy admissions is not unfair because we should support alumni, right? Because they're in our family, they're our friends. So it's a part of our community. And I have heard that a couple times, but I really am interested to see how this will follow. But if I could, can I go on a slight tangent just a little bit? Because as you all were talking, it made me think of enrollment a little bit broadly. One of the things that has not come into conversation, as far as I know, is that this attack on affirmative action and wiping it completely out is going to have an impact on attrition and retention. Because if individuals do get into colleges and they are people from different race and ethnicity backgrounds where they feel isolated, alone, imposter syndrome, the mental health is impacted because they are one of the few and they do not have these systems of support because institutions are divesting their resources and attention on diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. Why would I stay? What benefit is there in me staying? So I might have gotten here and it's been great, but I can't stay because it's not suiting me. So what happens to our retention pipelines in an already highly competitive environment? In the last 4 years, and we're looking forward another 20, there's a declining birth rate. And there are a lot of enrollment and admissions conversations about what is our competitive advantage? How are we going to increase the number of students that we have because our budgets are built on 20,000 students? We have to grow because that's a part of our strategic plan. But now we don't have the number of people that are born to achieve, everyone to achieve their strategic plan goals. And with this advantage that HWCUs have had, that advantage is now taken away from them because it was an atonement. It wasn't necessarily something that all desired to do. And so now with that taken away, what's the response going to be? Because one thing we've learned from the UC system is that race neutral policies do not work. We will not be able to achieve the levels that we have seen this academic year unless something creative, innovative, and that's driven by our students and those in power, such as Dr. Wilson pointed out, our tenured faculty members, community members, donors. We need more people to donate money to challenge these policies. And until that happens, I think we're going to see a broader, higher levels of attrition from a lot of these schools. And it's going to be harmful because one of the walkbacks that's going to happen is the push from athletic departments to say, diversify your sports that don't have majority Black, right? Let's diversify lacrosse, soccer, equestrian, whatever it might be. does that expectation fall back? And for those students that are there, do they have the resources to be retained? Like these are questions that we can't even grapple with yet because we haven't seen the effects of it. We don't know what people are going to do and not do. And with the lack of Black individuals and individuals of color, period, in higher athletic administration, we don't know if we even have the cadre of folks to stand up and lead in those spaces. And so it makes me think like, oh man, we're gonna have some retention issues we haven't even seen yet. And we can't even compete well. We can't achieve our goals of increasing our incoming freshmen or incoming transfer class. What are we gonna do when it comes to retaining faculty members who don't feel like they're seen? So higher ed is about to be impacted a significant amount, and legacy admissions is just one part of that, right? That's the one thing that they can still hold on to for a small population of folks. But I think we have to think even broader than that.
So I'm glad you brought up retention and attrition. Professor Wilson, can you speak to if we have fewer Black students on historically white campuses, fewer brown and Black students, the curriculum will change. Because if we don't have enough students to sign up for a course, then the course won't be offered. And so there goes African-American studies, ethnic studies, because you don't have interest. And that's how colleges operate: curriculum, faculty.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a real threat. It's interesting. I actually, I mentioned UCLA earlier. I attended law school at UCLA. I graduated in 2003, and this was after Proposition 209 gutted affirmative action there. So I was one of only 4 Black students in a class of 320 students. And so to Dr. Ferguson's point, this is going to have a detrimental impact on the number of students of color. And certainly I raise that because within my law school experience, there were certain classes, right, that had much lower enrollment, classes that might typically attract more Black students in particular, may not have had enough students to justify enrollment. So I think part of the challenge is going to be to impart to all students the importance of this curriculum. We spend so much time on students of color and how they're going to be impacted by the end of affirmative action, and rightly so, but white students also stand to lose in this situation. And so I think the idea that possibly we lose certain curricular offerings because we don't have enough students of color is a harm, certainly to the institution, to the faculty, to the department, and the students, but it's also a harm to the white students who should sign up and should broaden their understanding. And so I really want to emphasize the importance of not conceding. I think Dr. Cooper mentioned it has to be a long play strategy, and the curricular issue, pushing on that should definitely be a part of it. I think that we absolutely can't concede that we have to not take it as a given that we're going to have this this drop in students of color. We absolutely can't accept that, is what I'm trying to say, that we have to be willing to push, even if that means that we are talking about faculty strikes, student athletes refusing to play, whatever it takes to not capitulate and see a complete concession to the alternative reality that the Supreme Court is trying to drive us down.
Thank you. Dr. McIntosh, before we go to final comments with everyone, there have been some efforts to try to bring HBCUs more spotlight, more attention. And so at the Final Four, they have an HBCU All-Star game. And certainly that was done through a lot of organizing, including the advancement of Blacks in sports. But what do you see in terms of solutions, HBCUs playing a role or not playing a role, major role?
And I see those efforts quite a bit. It sort of likens to the NFL putting in racism on the back of a helmet and thinking magically that's going to move the needle. I wanted to sort of harken back to a comment made both by Dr. Cooper and Dr. Ferguson, is that we need to get in it for the long haul. And we need to also talk about some of the really dirty things that are happening in-house, not only as it relates to what's dealing with white Americans and Black Americans, but what's also happening in the house between African Americans as well. We need to talk about the fact that there is very little communication between Black faculty at PWIs and Black faculty at historically Black colleges and universities. There are very few partnerships. And so unless we start addressing some of those sort of house issues and home issues as it relates to that we all should be on the same page, that we're going to see that they're going to continue to divide and conquer. I speak and do a lot of national presentations, and it's almost as if some of my brothers and sisters have accepted the social caste system of them being faculty at a PWI and me being at a lower caste system because I'm at a historically Black college and university. And those sort of things, it sort of adds to the ability for these things to happen when they divide and conquer. So I see us moving forward where there has to be more solidarity. And there has to be this willingness to talk across to each other rather than at each other. And there has to be this understanding that, the tide, that all boats rise with the tide. And we can't continue to say that, well, this is what's happening at PWIs and to hell with what's happening with you at historically Black colleges and universities and other minority serving institutions as well, talking about those schools that serve Indigenous folks, those schools that serve Hispanics and Latinos. There has been this sort of self-inflicted, in some cases, social caste system. And we have to sort of break those barriers. I'm saying we, those of us who are in the profession, and understand that if we all don't tackle this together, then we're all going to drown together. And that's going to happen sooner rather than later. So I think one of the things we have to do constructively is to begin to engage each other in these conversations, not only about what they're doing to us, but what we're doing to each other. And those are some of the really nasty conversations, family reunion conversations that we need to start having, because that's what's going to really move the needle. I really loved it when Dr. Cooper said Black athletes at historically white colleges and historically Black colleges need to come together because they are all under that same system of labor, that their labor is being used to increase revenue. And so I like that idea, but I also understand that from my 30, 40 years in education, that we're still sort of maintaining this social caste system of professionals, not only in coaching, not only in academia, but we're doing it to ourselves. And until we sort of get out of that mindset and change this paradigm, we're not going to make very much, progress. Too many of us had utilized affirmative action and then pulled the ladder up behind us. Help me somebody, Clarence Thomas. You understand that just because you made it up the ladder, you're supposed to reach down and help someone else to also scale that ladder. And I think that's one of the things that has to happen. And if it doesn't, we're going to be in the same place 20 years from now. Deb and I will be having the same conversation because we still have not come together professionally or personally or as a community. I always talk about the reason why the Black community is in some of the shape it is because some of us deserted it. We left it. We left the Black community because of integration, and we left them behind, and we never looked back. And so those are some of the things that are going to have to happen. Some of you guys are going to have to come to historically Black college campuses and lecture and talk and converse with our students so that our students believe that we all have skin in the game. And once we do that, you're going to see some magical changes all over the nation. Thank you. Thank
you. You make me think about organizing and faculty working with students. Most of the protests, the gains that have been made have been by young people, student activism. And so we should consider the fact that with the increased cost of college, it makes it more difficult for people to organize and protest. Way back when, you would take your classes, find some food, hang out with some friends, or play your sports. But there was time to get together and organize. But with the increased cost of college now, you don't have time. You've got a second job, a third job. And of course, for the athletes, every bit of their schedule is filled. From film work to meeting with your assistants, teamwork, working out, nutrition. And so it's almost by design to set up so that there is no time to organize and find out what is going on your campus and in the community. Dr. Cooper, closing comments.
Well, first, I want to say thank you, Dr. Stroman, not only for organizing this panel, but for being an exemplar for so many of us. You've been a role model and a mentor to me, so I want to make sure to give you your flowers on this platform. In terms of final comments, the struggle continues and victory will be won. And I don't mean that in a cliche manner. I truly believe that the arc of the universe does bend towards justice, but it requires us to engage in a committed, protracted struggle to make that bend occur. And we have to be realistic that, as all of my colleagues have mentioned, that there are real oppositionists to everything that we discussed here today. And many of them are of different backgrounds than us. And as Dr. McIntosh mentioned, some are within the same backgrounds as us who don't view the issues in the exact same way and don't view the status quo as problematic. So I think it's important that we connect with like-minded individuals, that we do get beyond the tribalisms that Dr. McIntosh mentioned, whether it's based on neighborhood, institution type, social organization, even religions. If you think about during the civil rights movements and even some of the most successful human rights movements internationally, you had groups that came together across different religions, across different nations, across different groups, and they came together to challenge a broader issue. So I just encourage all of us to continue. I think it's important to have that self-care, particularly we talked about mental health. You don't have to do it all by yourself. None of us is an expert on everything. None of us has a monopoly on great ideas or strategies. It is going to require a collective effort. So let's, celebrate each other. Let's help each other. Similar to sports, there are going to be times where you're going to have to sub out of the game. You're still on the team, but you got to let somebody else, when I think about, Dr. Ferguson and her track and field accomplishments, there's usually, if it's a, 4x1, there's sometimes somebody will run in the heat and then somebody who will run in the final, right? Like there's this idea that in order to pass the baton, you have to give it to someone else. So that doesn't devalue your contribution. It actually enhances the success of the entire team. So I think, really taking a lot of the things that we've learned through sport that make teams successful, which include rest, which include nutrition, which include communicating across different backgrounds, and really applying that to our blueprint for the efforts that we're doing is critically important. So thank you again, Dr. Stroman, and thank you, colleagues, for your tremendous insights. I learned a tremendous amount from each of you.
Thank you. Professor Wilson.
So I just want to emphasize that there are no peaceful revolutions. And so I think that's an important point, because particularly on college campuses, a lot of us relish feeling comfortable, and to really make the change that needs to be made, there's going to have to be some discomfort. So we should wrap our heads around that, and we should not allow ourselves to get complacent or feel like this is what the Supreme Court said and this is what the university has to do. We should continue again to organize and push and make sure that we are providing a good blueprint for our students and our student athletes in particular on how to advocate and to fight for the kinds of communities that we ultimately want.
Thank you. Dr. Lapchick.
I feel the same way about this as everybody else. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I appreciate the comments that each of you made. I want to share Dr. Cooper's somewhat optimistic view that the change will come. He mentioned that I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement, and on May 10th of 1994, I was lucky enough to be invited by Nelson Mandela to his inauguration, and watched that a country that had been filled with more hate than any other country on the planet in the second half of the 20th century suddenly elect this man as president. Showed me that anything and everything is possible. And after it was over, he invited me to join him at a Zambia-South Africa soccer match in Johannesburg that afternoon, instead of going to all the diplomatic parties that were being held for him in Pretoria. And I said, Mr. President, why did you choose to come here instead of to those parties, pretty much knowing what his answer would be? And he said, I came here so my people would know that I was freed sooner than I would have and became president sooner than I would have because of the sacrifices our athletes made during this period of time of the boycott. And it's the best power of sports story I could think of. It makes me want to encourage the athlete activism that we've talked about to focus on the issues that we've been dealing with here today, because I believe they can have an impact.
Thank you. And Dr. Ferguson.
I think that a post-racial society cannot be forced, nor has it been achieved. And so because of that, we have to remember that we're not there yet. And it is not a Black response that is required, nor can Black people or brown people solve it. So as my colleagues have noticed and pointed out, is that it has to be community led. And this is why I look to the leadership of Black women. I think about Ella Baker and her role in the civil rights movement of being the strategist. There was not a role that she did not play behind the scenes. If she had to teach, she taught. If she had to speak, she would speak. If she had to raise money, she would do fundraising. And I think that's going to have to be our approach here. We have to be strategic and multi-pronged. We have to name things as they are and not shy away from them. So higher education institutions are employment powerhouses. There is power within our states and our regions and our cities to maximize and leverage that power fiscally, financially, and community-wide. And so how can we ensure and empower our leaders to take on that courage and that risk to serve as those influential community members and voices to start changing policies at the grassroots level, while there might be a long-term effort to shift this federally? We have to start thinking about our student athletes, not as always they're going to take up this fight because it looks like them. We have to create spaces where they are nurtured, where they are trained, they are supported, and they are protected. We cannot have the assumption that all student athletes will rise to this occasion and lead the way that we've seen from 1968 on. And so we have to create spaces for them to see the value in that risk. And so that means we have to make sure that they are supported, that they are recruited, and that they are retained and graduate and they become successful. So we need more of that. I would also say that we need more pathways and not pipelines. Pipelines are very stringent. Pathways are more accessible. And so pathways mean that we have to partner and collaborate across so many different lines and that we maximize every opportunity. And we also, I think we have to be process oriented and innovate. Innovation is not invention, right? We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. There are so many publications, institutes, grant related projects. There's a lot of work that has to go from theory to actual practice and then fixed again in order for these movements to be seen and the impact of those to be felt. And so I encourage those of us who have published, who have written, to take the courageous step to step forward and go from the Black and white to the sidelines. Start training, start teaching, and start doing the work with people and not just to inform them. And I think that's where we will see a lot of the impact, because so many people have so much information, but not a lot of us have the platforms, the ability, the courage, or even the invitation to put that into practice. So I want to encourage us to step a little bit more into the doing and not just the talking. And I know everyone on this call has done a lot, and that could be as an administrator, that could be as a community leader, and it could be as a parent. And so whatever it is that we can do, we should start to do it, particularly if we don't want the generation after us to experience what happened in the previous generations.
Thank you. People want to be problem solvers, but they don't want to study the problem. So I thank you, Dr. McIntosh, Dr. Cooper, Professor Wilson, Dr. Lapchick, Dr. Ferguson, for being problem solvers in the sense that you study first, you examine, you analyze. And I think this is going to be a topic that will continue on and on again. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your engagement. Let's remember that we are winning. These desperate moves are in response because we are winning. So we can be hopeful in this. The recording will be posted. Please follow the Center of Sport Business and Analytics on social media to receive access. Thanks again for tuning in.